The doorbell camera had been recording for exactly 47 seconds when HOA President Linda Hartwell made the accusation that would destroy her life forever. "Your husband is a thief," she screamed, pointing her finger directly at the camera, her face twisted with rage in crystal-clear 4K video. But what that doorbell camera captured wasn't just a meltdown. It was a confession to crimes that would send her to prison and expose over $1 million in theft. Before I show you the exact moment Karen's world collapsed, smash that like button and hit subscribe because this doorbell footage will blow your mind. Sarah Chin had no idea that her $89 doorbell camera would become the key evidence in a federal criminal investigation that would make headlines across the entire country. She was just a 34-year-old pediatric nurse working exhausting 12-hour night shifts at Children's Hospital, trying to provide for her 2 young children while building a life in what she thought was a safe family-friendly community. Sarah and her husband David, a software engineer at a local tech startup, had saved for years to afford their dream home in Oak Ridge Estates, a picturesque suburban neighborhood where they paid $425,000 for a modest 4-bedroom house with a backyard perfect for their kids Emma and Lucas to play in. They believed they were moving into the kind of community where neighbors looked out for each other, where children could ride bikes safely, and where summer barbecues and holiday decorations brought everyone together in the spirit of genuine friendship and connection. Instead, they walked into a nightmare controlled by Linda Hartwell, the 56-year-old HOA president who had turned their dream neighborhood into her personal kingdom of terror. The harassment started almost immediately after the Chin family moved in, just 3 weeks after unpacking their boxes. The first violation notice arrived in their mailbox on a Tuesday morning, citing that their mailbox was the wrong shade of black according to HOA guidelines that seemed designed specifically to create violations rather than maintain any reasonable community standards. Sarah had laughed it off initially, thinking it must be some kind of mistake or perhaps a computer error in the HOA system. But the violations kept coming with increasing frequency and absurdity. Children's toys visible from the street resulted in a $200 fine. Holiday decorations installed 1 day before the approved date brought a $350 penalty. A garden hose left coiled on their driveway instead of stored in the garage became improper equipment storage worth another fine. Linda Hartwell wasn't just an overzealous HOA president enforcing petty rules. She was running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been hiding in plain sight for over 6 years, and Sarah's family had unknowingly become her latest targets in a pattern of financial exploitation that had already destroyed a dozen families before them. Linda lived in the neighborhood's largest home, a sprawling 5,200-square-foot mansion with a perfectly manicured lawn and a circular driveway where her Mercedes S-Class sat gleaming in the sunlight. She wore designer clothes to every HOA meeting, took 4 international vacations per year to exotic destinations, and carried handbags that cost more than most families spent on groceries in 6 months. Yet she constantly claimed to be living on a fixed retirement income after her husband supposedly died 8 years ago, leaving her with what she described as comfortable but modest life insurance that barely covered her basic expenses. The red flags were everywhere for anyone paying attention, but most residents were too intimidated by Linda's aggressive enforcement tactics to question where her obvious wealth actually came from. She had forced 12 families to move out of Oak Ridge Estates over her 6 years as president, using excessive fines and legal threats to drive away anyone who dared challenge her authority or ask uncomfortable questions about the HOA's financial practices. She kept meticulous files on every resident, documenting their work schedules, their visitors, their daily routines, creating a surveillance system that would make authoritarian regimes proud. She knew which families were struggling financially and targeted them specifically with violations they couldn't afford to fight. She knew which residents were elderly or easily intimidated and used their fear to maintain absolute compliance with her increasingly absurd rules. The situation escalated dramatically when Sarah made an honest mistake with the neighborhood's Christmas decoration schedule. Working her chaotic nursing schedule with back-to-back night shifts, Sarah had put up Christmas lights on December 1st, completely forgetting that HOA rules specified December 5th as the earliest allowable date for holiday decorations. It was an innocent error that should have warranted nothing more than a polite reminder, perhaps a warning letter at worst. Instead, Linda issued a $500 fine plus a $200 administrative fee. When Sarah called to politely explain the mistake and ask for leniency, offering to immediately take down the decorations and reinstall them on the correct date, Linda's response was nothing short of nuclear. She refused to waive any portion of the fine and actually increased it to $1,000 for what she called insubordination and failure to respect HOA authority. David Chin wasn't the type of person to accept injustice without asking questions. As a software engineer with an analytical mind trained to identify patterns and solve complex problems, he started noticing things about the HOA finances that didn't add up at all. The threatening letters about foreclosure proceedings over Christmas decorations had pushed him past his breaking point, and he began doing what he did best, digging into data and following the numbers to see where they actually led. He requested copies of the HOA financial statements, which were technically public records available to any homeowner according to the community bylaws that Linda seemed to conveniently forget whenever they didn't serve her purposes. What he discovered in those financial statements made his blood run cold and confirmed every suspicion that had been building in his mind over the past 18 months of living under Linda's tyrannical rule. The numbers were staggering in their brazenness. Administrative fees totaling $340,000 over 6 years with no detailed explanation of what those fees actually covered or why they were necessary. Monthly landscaping fees that were 400% higher than market rates for similar services in neighboring communities. Security services that nobody could remember ever seeing. Pool maintenance charges for a community pool that had been closed for renovations for 3 years. Legal consulting fees that exceeded what most small businesses paid for full-time legal counsel. And the most damning detail of all, Linda Hartwell was the only person with signature authority on the HOA bank accounts, with no oversight, no checks and balances, and no independent audits despite the bylaws clearly requiring annual financial reviews by outside accounting firms. David went deeper, using his technical skills to cross-reference the vendor contracts listed in the financial statements. He discovered Hartwell Property Services LLC, supposedly a landscaping company run by Linda's nephew that was receiving $8,000 per month for services that comparable companies in the area provided for $1,500. But when David searched for this nephew in public records, he found nothing. The company was registered to someone with Linda's maiden name, Thompson. It wasn't her nephew's company at all. It was Linda paying herself, funneling HOA money directly into her personal accounts through a shell company that existed only on paper. He found similar patterns with other vendors. Summit Security Solutions for security services that nobody ever saw. Oak Ridge Legal Consulting for legal advice that the HOA attorney knew nothing about. Blue Ridge Pool and Spa for maintenance on a pool that hadn't been operational in years. Every single vendor traced back to Linda through various shell companies and fake business registrations. David compiled everything into a detailed report, complete with financial analysis, market rate comparisons and documentation of the shell companies. He contacted 15 other families who had been targeted with excessive fines, and together they planned to present the findings at the next HOA board meeting and demand an immediate independent audit of all accounts. They had the evidence, they had the numbers, and they had the legal right to transparency in how their HOA dues were being spent. 2 weeks before that board meeting, David and Sarah installed a Ring doorbell camera at their front door, primarily for general home security and to keep an eye on package deliveries while Sarah worked her night shifts at the hospital. They had no idea that this simple security device would capture the most important evidence in what would become the largest HOA fraud investigation in FBI history. Linda somehow discovered that David was investigating the HOA finances. Perhaps she saw him talking to other neighbors, or maybe her paranoid control freak nature simply sensed that someone was finally asking the question she had been desperate to avoid for 6 years. On the morning of December 15th at exactly 9:47 a.m., the doorbell camera's motion sensor activated as Linda's Mercedes came screeching to a stop in the Chin family's driveway. Sarah was at the hospital finishing her night shift and wouldn't be home for hours. The kids were at school. David was working from home in his office. The camera recorded everything as Linda stormed up to the front door, her face already flushed with rage, clutching a folder that she claimed contained evidence of David's crimes, pounding on the door 14 times with increasing aggression that the camera's audio captured in perfect clarity. David opened the door with his usual polite demeanor, completely unprepared for the hurricane of accusations that was about to be unleashed on his doorstep and permanently recorded in crystal clear high-definition video. "Good morning, Linda. Can I help you with something?" he said calmly, his voice steady and respectful despite the obvious aggression radiating from the woman standing on his porch. Linda didn't waste a single second on pleasantries or reasonable conversation. "You've been snooping in HOA business that doesn't concern you," she snarled, her finger already pointing accusingly at David's chest while the doorbell camera captured every word, every gesture, every micro-expression of guilt and rage that flickered across her face. David remained remarkably composed, his engineering background giving him the ability to stay logical even when confronted with irrational anger. "Linda, I've been reviewing public HOA financial statements," he replied in a measured tone. That's every homeowner's right according to our bylaws. You can't just go through my private records, Linda screamed, her voice rising to a pitch that made neighbors 2 houses away look up from their morning routines. They're not private, Linda, David explained patiently. They're HOA records. And I found some irregularities that I'd like to discuss with the board at Thursday's meeting. That's when Linda completely lost whatever fragile control she had been maintaining. The transformation was visible on camera, her face shifting from anger to pure panic as she realized that David knew that her carefully constructed empire of theft was about to come crashing down around her. At exactly 9:47 and 23 seconds according to the camera's timestamp, Linda raised her arm and pointed her finger directly at the camera lens, perfectly framing herself for the moment that would destroy her life. Your husband is a thief, she screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysteria. He's stealing from the HOA. He's embezzling money from every family in this neighborhood. David stood there in stunned silence, his face registering complete shock at the absurdity of the accusation. What? Linda, that's completely false. I've never taken a penny from anyone. But Linda was too far gone to hear reason, too deep in her panic to realize she was destroying herself with every word. I have proof, she shrieked, waving her folder in the air like it contained smoking gun evidence instead of whatever desperate fabrications she had thrown together. You've been taking money from the HOA accounts. I'm calling the police right now. What made this moment absolutely insane was that Linda was accusing David of the exact crime she herself had been committing for over 6 years. Every accusation that came spilling out of her mouth was a perfect description of her own criminal behavior, and the doorbell camera was recording every single self-incriminating word. I've been tracking every transaction, she continued, her voice getting louder and more desperate. I know about your shell companies. I know about the fake invoices you've been submitting to steal from your neighbors. I have records of hundreds of thousands of dollars that you've stolen from this community. David just stared at her, his analytical mind trying to process how someone could project their own crimes so completely onto an innocent person. Linda, I don't have any shell companies, he said quietly. I don't have any fake invoices. I've never submitted a single invoice to the HOA for anything. But I do have evidence that someone has been doing exactly what you're describing, and I was planning to present it at Thursday's board meeting with a formal request for an independent audit. The camera captured the exact moment when Linda's face changed from rage to panic to the dawning realization that she had said too much. You can't prove anything, she stammered, her earlier confidence crumbling. I've been careful. All the records are. She stopped mid-sentence, her hand flying to her mouth as she understood what she had just admitted. By saying she had been careful with records, she had essentially confessed to hiding evidence of financial crimes. Neighbors were starting to emerge from their homes now, drawn by the screaming. 4 people were visible in the camera's wide-angle view, and at least one of them had pulled out their phone and started recording the confrontation from a different angle. One neighbor, a retired police officer named Tom Martinez, immediately recognized what he was witnessing and pulled out his cell phone to call 911. Within 8 minutes, 2 police officers arrived at the scene to find Linda still on David's porch, still ranting about theft and embezzlement, still describing in perfect detail the crimes that she herself had committed. If you're loving this doorbell justice story, smash that subscribe button right now and hit the notification bell. Comment karma below if you believe entitled criminals always expose themselves eventually. Trust me, what the FBI found when they raided Linda's mansion will absolutely blow your mind. The police officers who responded to the domestic disturbance call had no idea they were about to stumble into one of the largest HOA fraud cases in their jurisdiction's history. Linda immediately switched into victim mode the moment she saw the uniforms, her hysterical anger transforming into tearful desperation as she pointed at David and claimed he had been harassing her for months and stealing from the entire neighborhood. Officers, this man has been threatening me and embezzling money from our homeowners association, she sobbed, her performance worthy of an Academy Award if it weren't so transparently manipulative. I have evidence right here in this folder. Please arrest him before he destroys more lives. David remained completely calm, his military-like composure serving him well in this surreal situation. Officers, I have video of this entire interaction recorded on my doorbell camera, and I have financial records that tell a very different story about who's actually been stealing from this neighborhood. The retired police detective neighbor, Tom Martinez, stepped forward to vouch for David's character and explain that he had witnessed the entire confrontation from his front yard. Officer, I'm former Detective Tom Martinez, 25 years with the department before I retired. I've known the Chun family since they moved in 18 months ago. They're good people. But I've had my own suspicions about Mrs. Hartwell's financial management of the HOA for quite some time now. The officers asked to review the doorbell footage immediately, and what they saw on David's phone as he played back the recording made both of them exchange significant glances. They could see Linda's aggressive approach, hear her screaming accusations, and most importantly, hear her accidentally describing crimes in language that suggested intimate knowledge of how such fraud schemes operate. Officers asked Linda if they could see the HOA financial records she kept mentioning. Her refusal was immediate and defensive. "Those records are private HOA business," Linda snapped, her voice taking on the authoritarian tone she had used to bully neighbors for years. "You have no right to demand them without a warrant." The officers explained calmly that according to HOA bylaws, financial records were actually public documents available to any homeowner, and her refusal to provide them was raising serious red flags about her behavior. Linda became increasingly belligerent with the officers, which only strengthened their suspicion that something criminal was hiding beneath her aggressive defensiveness. The officers contacted the fraud division, and within 2 hours Detective Sarah Morrison arrived to take over what had transformed from a neighborhood dispute into a potential felony investigation. Detective Morrison obtained a warrant for the HOA bank records, and what forensic accountants discovered over the next 3 weeks was staggering in its scope and audacity. Linda had been running a sophisticated embezzlement scheme through multiple shell companies, all registered under variations of her maiden name or fictitious business entities that existed only on paper. Hartwell Property Services had stolen $576,000 over 6 years through fake landscaping invoices. Summit Security Solutions had siphoned $198,000 for security services that never existed. Oak Ridge Legal Consulting had taken $142,000 for legal advice nobody ever received. Blue Ridge Pool and Spa had collected $89,000 for maintaining a pool that had been closed for years. The total came to over $1 million stolen directly from her neighbors, money that had funded Linda's luxury lifestyle while she lectured families about fiscal responsibility and community standards. The FBI became involved when investigators discovered that Linda had been transferring stolen funds to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, which triggered federal wire fraud jurisdiction. At 6 o'clock on a cold January morning, FBI agents executed a raid on Linda's mansion while news cameras that had been tipped off by neighbors captured every moment of her humiliation. Linda was led out in handcuffs, screaming about persecution and illegal searches, still unable to accept that her criminal empire had finally collapsed. Inside her home, agents found filing cabinets stuffed with fake invoices, ledgers documenting the entire fraud scheme, and most damning of all, a notebook literally titled HOA Revenue Extraction Plan that detailed her strategies for maximizing theft while minimizing suspicion. The evidence was so overwhelming that Linda's expensive defense attorney advised her to accept a plea deal, but her arrogance wouldn't allow her to admit guilt even when facing 340 years in prison across 97 federal charges. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the moment that destroyed any remaining sympathy came when prosecutors played the doorbell camera footage on a massive screen in the courtroom. Linda's voice echoed through the silent room as she screamed about shell companies and fake invoices and hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars, accidentally confessing to her own crimes while trying to frame an innocent man. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. At her sentencing hearing, 23 families submitted victim impact statements describing how Linda's theft and harassment had devastated their finances and destroyed their sense of security. The judge showed no mercy, sentencing Linda to 22 years in federal prison with full restitution of $1,005,000. All her assets were seized and liquidated, her mansion sold with proceeds distributed to the families she had victimized for years. If this story of doorbell camera justice restored your faith in karma, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories where technology exposes criminals who thought they'd never get caught. Comment justice served if you believe every HOA president should face mandatory financial audits. Share this with anyone dealing with a corrupt HOA because accountability is coming for every Linda Hartwell hiding in plain sight.